Please welcome to the stage Alex Sarian, President and CEO, Arts Commons.
Hi, everybody. My name is Alex Sarian. I am a 40-year-old white male. I have brown hair, a graying beard. I'm wearing glasses, a green jacket, a dark blue shirt, and brown khaki pants. So we're going to start. I've prepared two different talks, and I'm going to ask you a question, and how you answer the question will determine what talk I have. So you only have yourself to blame. So the question is, and it's a trick question by design, so don't overthink it. The question is, what's more important, the intention of the artist or the perception of the audience? Now, I'm going to ask the question again, and I'm going to ask you if you think that the intention of the artist is more important, please raise your hand. So if you think the intention of the artist is more important, please raise your hand. Now you know who not to hang out with at drinks later. If you think the perception of the audience is more important, please raise your hand. Okay, I knew I'd love this room. So my name is Alex Sarian. I have the privilege of serving as the president and CEO at Arts Commons in Calgary, and I'm here representing an incredible team and community with some colleagues in the room. So for years across the world, I think we have all been witnessing collectively a trend of our work becoming a luxury good that is being overconsumed by too few people. Over the past few months, it's become clear that the arts sector should not, and in some cases literally could not, return to pre-pandemic ways. And I think all one has to do today is open up the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal to read about another one of our peers having to make incredibly difficult decisions to modify business models that have been unsustainable for far too long. The pandemic for all of us became an enforced shutdown that gave us, or ought to have given us, the opportunity to reevaluate everything that we know about how art is created and delivered, and about who is doing the creating, delivering, and receiving. Fundamentally, we were invited to reevaluate everything about where and how and why culture and community intersect and interact. At Arts Commons, this reevaluation is happening at a time when we're also breathing new life into the now $660 million Arts Commons Transformation Project, which is the largest cultural infrastructure project in Canada. Originally conceived of in 2008 as an expansion and modernization campaign, today we're focusing on a different version of transformation, not just physical transformation, but rather also philosophical transformation. As I say to my board, or as I said to my board when I got to Calgary in 2020, anybody with the right amount of money can build a building. Now, I said that a little too flippantly, it's not that easy, but anybody with the right amount of money can build a building. What matters is whether our building is the physical manifestation of who we're becoming. And who we're becoming revolves around building new kinds of relationships with new communities that surround us. In 2020, leaning into this civic dialogue or into this commitment was seemingly at odds with the push of having to accelerate our relationship with technology as a means of creating and distributing content. Technology has provided far more choices, far more diversity, and the perception of a far more democratic process, selection process in what we consume. And that's not going to change anytime soon, but I fear that what we've lost in this process is a commitment to collective, shared, and social experiences. I think it's pretty safe to assume that because of technology, every single one of us in this room probably consumed more entertainment during the first year of the pandemic than in the history of humankind. The difference is that we probably did that consuming predominantly by ourselves and in private. Now, during the pandemic, I had the opportunity of sitting on a panel, a Comic-Con panel, with a mental health practitioner who made the point that when we consume arts and culture by ourselves, we may actually be doing more harm than good, regardless of how much more we're taking in. Because when we're alone, he said, or with people who think like us, one could argue that we're living in an echo chamber of our own biases. Whatever we choose to consume, we are picking something that reinforces a belief we already had, and we are doing it to comfort our biases in many ways. When we share space with others like we're doing today, whether it's 10 people or 1,000 people, Our experience of consuming culture is incredibly different. I know I'm preaching to the choir when I say that a song or a punchline or a joke can land differently with me than with the person I'm sitting next to. If a stranger laughs at a joke and I don't, or vice versa, we experience what mental health professionals call emotional referencing, as we compare our emotional response to that of others. The moment that somebody has an emotional response that we don't, our brains start firing in brand new ways. Why did that person laugh and I didn't? Why am I in tears and they aren't? Emotional referencing allows us to confront our biases and is a key process by which empathy is taught. And without empathy, the capacity to imagine ourselves in another person's shoes, a healthy society cannot exist. But this trend towards isolating isn't new. It's been accelerated over the past 3 years because beyond the appeal of convenience and sometimes cost, most of us had little to no choice. Case in point, as gyms were shutting down through the pandemic, Peloton witnessed spectacular growth in their online subscriptions growing 10 times between 2019 and 2022. For the record, I had no part in that growth whatsoever. Now, at Arts Commons in Calgary, moving some of our live series into digital experiences actually tripled our viewership during the pandemic, with 80% of audiences being brand new to us, which obviously was fantastic. But the question then became whether our new virtual audience would drive demand for an in-person experience post-pandemic. And we're actually starting to realize that maybe it hasn't, with less than 20% of new online viewers becoming in-person patrons. And like many, monetizing online content became a futile effort, not because the technology wasn't there, but because we hadn't been spending the time building relationships with our audiences and communities. At Arts Commons, we've since announced a partnership with Canon and invested over $1 million in digital infrastructure. So we're not giving up on this exploration, but we're going to take our time getting it right. Now, during the pandemic, we also did something else. We launched an outdoor concert series across Calgary's 4 quadrants. While perhaps seemingly unsophisticated at first glance, we were incredibly strategic and intentional in terms of where we deployed these concerts, how we deployed them, and why we deployed them. We reflected on relationships we had and on those we didn't. Now, I'll be the first to say it's incredibly important to look at the people who buy our tickets and subscriptions and love them very hard. Retention is challenging work, but it's a little harder to wonder who's not coming to us and ask ourselves why. So we use this opportunity to find out. For those of you that may not know, Calgary is Canada's 3rd most diverse city, and yet most of the hundreds of thousands of people that walk through our doors every year at Arts Commons didn't necessarily reflect that. So the first thing we did was take a look at a heat map of where people were coming to us from, and then quickly identified areas across our city in which we had few to no relationships. Unsurprisingly, one of those areas was Calgary's northeast quadrant, a part of our city that has the highest proportion of residents who identify as visible minorities compared to the overall population of the region, around 80%, with most of them being from South Asian countries or communities. Now, we could have easily taken a look at that map and said, there is a cultural desert that needs our help. Nothing could be farther from the truth. That way of thinking is just wrong, irresponsible, and ridiculous. Because I would argue that no quadrant in our city is prouder of how they define and celebrate cultural identities. We've just never had the urgency or need to engage with them. Now, over the course of the pandemic, we produced 200 concerts, most of which were located in neighborhoods where people had no idea what Arts Commons was. We did so in partnership with local community leaders, and we started by asking if there were any artists in those neighborhoods who were already celebrated by local residents. We weren't importing our definition of culture. We were using our resources and platforms to elevate and celebrate theirs. We ended up hiring around 400 artists locally, most of whom had never worked with us, and built relationships with 13,000 Calgarians on their terms and on their turf. It was during this process of designing this program and launching this program that we stopped asking the question, what are we good at? And started asking the question, what are we good for? Again, none of this is rocket science. But we didn't stop there, because now is when the hard work begins. After years of being welcomed into people's backyards, we needed to demonstrate that we were a changed organization because of them. I think too often we wax poetic about the impact we have on others, and rarely do we stop to measure other people's impact on us. And that's where dialogue comes in. So as the pandemic measures began to ease last year, we intentionally partnered with a promoter who was touring Southeast Asian artists across Canada, but somehow skipping Calgary. Between May and September of 2022, we hosted 13 concerts featuring artists like Atif Aslam, Neha Nakar, and Farhad Daria. Finally, after years of pandemic, we were able to reciprocate the hospitality and generosity by inviting our new friends to Arts Commons to celebrate a definition of culture influenced by them. And as a result, and this is crazy, but as a result, in the summer of 2022, while most arts organizations were struggling to reopen, we had the busiest summer in Arts Commons' 40-year history. Now, I was blown away, and honestly somewhat confused, that what seemed like such an obvious course of action was being considered risky or innovative. I would share this story with peers and friends who would say to me that they'd never be able to afford to do something like that, to which I would say, you can't afford not to. We couldn't afford not to. As people started traveling and filling arenas again and canceling their Peloton subscriptions, at Arts Commons, we couldn't help but be curious about where and why people would want to spend their time and money again. When people lag in returning to some of our programs, but they aren't dragging their feet in resuming other aspects of their lives, that tells me that pre-pandemic, we in the arts probably didn't do a terribly good job of articulating a relevant value proposition. In late 2022, in December, a study was released on the impact of the impact of the pandemic on performing arts center audiences. From May of 2020 to December of 2022, so almost 3 full seasons, researchers tracked audience perspectives at more than 50 participating venues across North America, totaling almost 300,000 patrons. So a pretty big sample. The most fascinating thing to come out of that study was the way audiences described the barriers in returning to in-person events. In third place, now mind you, this is December. In third place, and climbing, was cost, and that has probably gone up. In second place, and declining rapidly, was the fear of transmitting or getting infected by COVID-19. But the largest barrier and growing was the fact that audiences had not yet found an event they wanted to attend. What that says to me is that because of the tight dollars and the financial situation getting more complicated and pandemic-related fears that aren't leaving, audiences felt they needed a more compelling reason to leave their house. That's literally what we do. But regardless of interpretation, what the data is telling us is that audiences have become less and less persuaded that our programming is a worthy cause of their discretionary spending and leisure time. So my hypothesis is that as a sector, we have not been offering enough of what people are interested in experiencing, and my fear is that we're suffering the consequences of that today. So whenever I'm given the opportunity, I love asking that silly question. What's more important, the intention of the artist or the perception of the audience? We could talk about it for hours, and I usually do. And we have drinks later, so who knows? But that tension between intention and perception is really at the core of a healthy arts community. Holding intention and perception in a healthy balance is where we create meaningful and transformative dialogue. And I think today more than ever, I think we can all agree that building community around tension is a lost art, and we could all stand to invest in it a little more. As an arts organization that takes its civic responsibility incredibly serious, our duty at Arts Commons is to build community in and around cultural experiences. And there has never been in our lifetime a greater urgency to bring people together, for that process of emotional referencing, and to build a new sense of cohesion. The more the world pushes us to isolate and divide, which it is, the greater the urgency becomes for us that deliver collective experiences that we clearly still need. And what drives me crazy is that many of us are still not taking advantage of that opportunity, of that responsibility. In Calgary, we're approaching the future of the arts from the perspective of communal and collective participation instead of transactional consumption. Instead of thinking we have the answers, we're focusing on what questions to ask. And instead of telling people what they want to see or what they should see, we are creating spaces and facilitating conversations in and around the arts. I honestly can't think of a better gift for our cities, our communities, and our world than that today. I would normally ask the question again, to see how many of you have changed your mind, but it seems pretty clear and pretty obvious that you all are part of that belief that we need to be engaging with others, and particularly those of our audiences and communities that we depend so strictly on. So I want to thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to spending more time with you in the next few days.